Up to a certain point, I had an ordinary life. For me, friendship is an opportunity to rely on a person and be sure that he or she will not let you down. It comes when difficulties arise, and a friend is always ready to come to the rescue. To me, that is the essence of true friendship. However, everything changes the moment a friend starts paying attention to your wife. My name is Scene, and I'm a mechanic. My life is closely tied to cars, especially the vintage Mustang my father gave me for my 18th birthday. That car is not just a vehicle, it is a part of me, a reminder of my home and who I am. My wife Helen works as a librarian and is in college. We've been together for 3 years, and in that time we haven't had any major fights. In our free time, we like to walk in the park, watch movies, and sometimes go out with friends. We can go to a club or sit in a bar. But there is one but about our sex life. I know Helen wants more than I can give her. My job is physically exhausting and I'm often tired by the evening, which sometimes frustrates her. I try not to see the disappointment in her eyes, but it's hard. On the other hand, I realize that if I stop working, we'll have nothing. I have friends, a special group of people. Carlos, a couple years younger than me, is in college. He's a real gym buff and always wants to be the center of attention. There's also Amber, Helen's best friend since high school, and her boyfriend Fred. Fred and I aren't as close as we could be, but our girlfriends keep us together. All in all, he doesn't bother me. It all started with a call from Carlos. He suggested a weekend at the lake, a resort area where we could swim and get away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The idea seemed tempting, but I decided to check with Helen first. Helen came home in the evening. I wanted to share the news with her, but she already knew about the plans before I did, which made me wary. Carlos didn't usually call her directly. Why would he choose to do so now? Helen was thrilled with the idea and insisted we go. She assured me it would be a great opportunity to spend time together, especially since Fred could drive us in his big old SUV with enough room for the 5 of us. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the trip. Helen was already planning what we would take with us. Her excitement was contagious. We sat in the kitchen, surrounded by maps and guidebooks she found at the library where she worked. "It's going to be great, Scene," she said, smiling genuinely. I couldn't help but agree with her. Her optimism always kept me going. That night as we ate dinner, I noticed that Helen was increasingly distracted by her phone. Carlos had sent a list of things to take. She explained it to me, and I nodded, trying to hide my irritation. It wasn't that I didn't trust Carlos, but his sudden interest in my wife struck me as odd. Why hadn't he written to me? The next day, Helen and I went shopping. We needed to buy everything we needed for the trip, mostly bathing suits, food, and drinks. Helen was in her element, choosing the best and most comfortable things. I was particularly struck by her new swimsuit, which was quite revealing. I barely restrained myself from getting too close to her right in the fitting room. "We'll only be there for a couple days, Helen, not a month," I joked as I watched her carefully pick out her things. She smiled sweetly back and continued her search. On the way home, we discussed our travel plans. Fred agreed to drive us in his SUV. "It's going to be perfect, Scene. You'll see," Helen said, holding my hand. And she was right. The day before the trip, we packed up all of our stuff and loaded it into the car. Carlos and Fred arrived at our place pretty early to avoid the morning traffic. Amber was already waiting for us in the car, eagerly awaiting the start of our adventure. During the drive, Helen chatted continuously with Amber and the boys. I was a little uneasy. Not that I minded, but I was consumed with my own thoughts. I felt like I had forgotten something important, left something unspoken. However, looking at Helen, happy and carefree, those thoughts receded. When we arrived at the place, I was struck by the beauty of the surrounding nature. The recreation center turned out to be a real paradise. The house we got stood on the shore of the lake, and from the balcony we had a magnificent view of the mountains. "How about that?" Helen asked, putting her arm around my waist. "It's wonderful," I replied, and at that moment I was genuinely thinking about it. We spent the rest of the day at the lake, swimming and enjoying the sunshine. In the evening, sitting by the fire, I looked at Helen and thought about how much this person meant to me. All my doubts and fears seemed so distant and unimportant, but the night brought with it a restlessness. Helen was tossing and turning in bed, and I pretended to be asleep, watching her. When she got up and left the room, I thought she had just gone to the bathroom, so I just lay there. The wait seemed to last about 30 minutes. When Helen came back to bed, I asked, "What's wrong, honey?" "Oh, Scene, are you awake?" "I just went to the bathroom." "I probably shouldn't have eaten that cheese," she said. That calmed me down, and eventually we fell asleep in each other's arms. Waking up early in the morning, the first thing I felt was the cold, fresh air seeping in through the ajar window. I turned to Helen, who was sleeping peacefully. There was a look of calmness on her face. I decided not to wake her and went to the balcony. The view was truly mesmerizing. The mountains, shrouded in morning mist, rose gently above the calm surface of the lake. I breathed in the cool air, trying to shake off the remnants of the night's anxiety. The day promised to be eventful. When everyone was awake, we gathered in the kitchen for breakfast. Helen was full of energy and suggested we spend the day at the lake. Her enthusiasm quickly spread to all of us, and we happily agreed. Amber and Fred were already ready for new adventures, and Carlos seemed eager to finally relax on the water. Carlos was shirtless as usual, showing off his toned arms and abs to everyone. After breakfast, we headed to the lake. I noticed that Helen and Carlos were whispering together, but decided not to develop a conflict over it. They were probably just discussing the details of our day on the water. I didn't want to ruin the mood for myself or anyone else over nothing. The lake was incredibly beautiful. The water was so clear that you could see every pebble on the bottom. We rented a boat and went swimming. We wanted to go all the way to the center of the lake and jump into the water from the side. The sun was shining brightly and a light breeze brought a cool breeze. Helen laughed and joked, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. In those moments, I forgot about everything in the world. The sun reflected off her smooth, soft skin. I thought that if I didn't have sunglasses, I would go blind. We jumped into the water, swimming and enjoying every minute of it. Helen was happy, and seeing her like that was all I needed. For a moment, I thought all my doubts and worries were for nothing. Back home in the evening, we decided to have a barbecue. Carlos took on the role of chef, while Fred and I did the preparations. Amber and Helen decorated the tables and prepared the appetizers. Everything was going perfectly. I felt like I was part of something bigger, something important. However, as night fell and everyone began to retire to their rooms, my anxiety returned. Helen was acting strange again, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going on between her and Carlos. I went to bed, and due to extreme fatigue and sunburn, my eyes closed quickly and I fell asleep. I don't remember if Helen was asleep at that point, but I hope she hadn't gone anywhere. The next morning, my eyes opened even before the first rays of sunlight broke through the curtains. The night was restless, and I often woke up listening to the silence, occasionally broken only by the noise of the lake. Helen seemed calm, but her unusual behavior last night still worried me. After breakfast, which was light and relaxed, I noticed that Helen often glanced at Carlos. I wanted to think I was exaggerating, but these little moments made me doubt it. We decided to go for a walk in the forest surrounding our retreat. The forest was thick and cool, filled with the sounds of nature. Amber and Fred walked ahead, chatting merrily, while Helen, Carlos, and I followed behind them. I thought there was some invisible attraction between them that I couldn't ignore on the way back to the house. Helen took my hand and smiled, as if trying to assure me that everything was okay. I responded with a smile, trying to dispel the anxious thoughts. In the evenings, we had an outdoor movie screening. Fred found an old projector, and we sat on the grass with popcorn and blankets. Everything seemed perfect, but I could still feel the tension in the air. After the movie, when everyone had gone to bed, Helen said she was going for a walk. "I need some fresh air," she explained. I offered to go with her, but she insisted on being alone. Her words sounded convincing, but I couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety. Lying in bed and listening to the house absorb the silence of the night, I couldn't sleep. Thoughts of Helen, her strange nocturnal wanderings, and her exchanges of glances with Carlos kept me awake. I decided I had to get to the bottom of this as soon as possible. When Helen returned an hour later, she tried to be quiet, but I was already sitting up in bed waiting. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to hide the worry in my voice. She nodded. "Everything's fine, just sat by the lake today. It was such a busy day, I got dizzy." Her words sounded unconvincing to me, but I invited her into bed and tried to get close to her out of decency. "Scene, not now, it's late and I don't feel well," she said. This upset me. I turned away from her and went to bed. 20 minutes later, I felt Helen trying to wake me up. Scene, are you asleep? She said. I decided not to answer, and she repeated the same thing about 10 minutes later. But I didn't give her an answer either. Then she got up and walked out the door. I heard footsteps on the stairs. She was coming downstairs. The house was a 2-story house. There were 2 rooms on the second floor, one for Helen and I, and one for Amber and Fred, while Carlos slept downstairs on the soft fold-out couch. After lying in bed for about 15 minutes, I decided to leave the room and check to see where Helen had disappeared to. Carefully opening the door, I found myself in the hallway. I started crawling toward the stairs by feel so that I could listen through the silence to what was going on downstairs. I heard Helen's faint moans as if something was gagging her. I then began to cautiously descend the stairs and got a full view as I descended, wanting to go unnoticed. I took my phone with me, turning its brightness down to minimum beforehand. I pulled out my phone, eager to take a quick photo. As I pressed the button, I realized I had forgotten to turn off the flash that revealed my presence. The room was dark, but the moonlight streaming through the window illuminated their silhouettes. They turned toward me like guilty children caught stealing cookies. The world around them seemed to stop. I descended even further. All I saw was Helene and Carlos. Ellen was sitting on Carlos, covered only by a thin blanket. I couldn't utter a word. My breathing quickened and I felt anger fill every cell in my body. Carlos tried to say something, pushing Helen away from him and moved toward me, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. But that only made me more furious. I didn't listen to him. When he got too close to me, I reflexively punched him in the face, causing him to fall to the ground. Helen began to cry, whispering my name. But her tears, like drops of acid, only made my pain worse. I took a step back, trying to gather my thoughts. Everything inside me screamed with pain and betrayal. My wife, my love, was with another. My friend. I could feel the world I had built around us crumbling before my eyes. "How could you?" I said. "I'm sorry, it's just that I haven't had sex in so long, and Carlos was so masculine and handsome," she said. "Do you realize what you're saying to your husband? Heck, you know he only got that physique because of the pills," I said. I'm sorry, she said, trying to get up and walk over to me. "Don't come any closer to me. You didn't even use protection, did you?" I asked. "It was my fault, I'm sorry," she said. "And you probably didn't know Carlos has an STD, right?" I asked. Carlos did indeed have a disease known only to me. He had shared it with me a year and a half ago, and I had kept that information secret. If I had known he would be interested in my wife, I certainly would have warned Helen in advance. "Are you kidding?" She began with concern in her eyes. "No, dear, you're in big trouble," I said. Then I asked her a question. "How long ago was the first time you weren't honest with me?" "The very first day we came here," she replied. "At least that's something good," I said. At that moment, Helen was sobbing. I didn't even notice Amber and Fred come down from behind the noise and witness the whole scene. "Do you understand?" I said to Helen and threw my wedding ring at her so that it hit her forehead and she screamed. "Ow!" I headed for the exit. I needed to go outside. I stepped outside and took a deep breath of the night air. The sky was studded with stars, but their light seemed cold and lifeless to me. That night I lost everything I loved. The emptiness throbbed in my chest, leaving behind only a shadow of who I used to be. I heard a noise from the house and saw Carlos wake up, stand up and start yelling at Fred. At that moment I saw Fred hit Carlos again and he fell to the floor. I smirked when I saw this and started laughing hysterically. Fred came over to me and suggested we sit down at the kitchen table to talk things over. I went to follow him. We sat down at the kitchen table and I told them everything I had learned and thought. They listened attentively, not interrupting me, letting me spill out everything that had built up inside. At this point, Helen was sitting on the couch crying. She tried to say something, but each time I told her to shut up. "What are you going to do?" Fred asked when I was done. I shook my head. All my plans and dreams for a future with Helen shattered in an instant. "I don't know," was all I could say. Amber took my hands in hers. "We're with you, Scene. Whatever you decide to do, we'll support you," she said. No one could have imagined this would happen. Her words were like balm on my wounds. In that moment, I realized that I was free of all pain. I was not alone. I realized that we needed to act and teach them a lesson. Amber and Fred went upstairs to gather their things while I kept an eye on Carlos, who, to my relief, was alive. Helen watched from the couch as Fred and Amber came down with their bags. "Are you leaving?" she asked. "Yes, but there's only room for 3 in the car. You and Carlos will have to go your own way," I replied. I estimated that it would take us about 5 hours by car to get back to town. "Are you kidding me?" she said with indignation. "You had no problem sneaking up the stairs every night, so what's the problem getting to town with your macho ass?" I asked. "So it's over between us then?" she asked. "No, I just set it all up for fun," I said sarcastically. "Honey, stop it. We're going to make up. This is a misunderstanding. You said yourself that making mistakes is healthy," she said. "First of all, I'm not your honey anymore, and secondly, I don't want to talk to you," I replied. At that moment, Fred brought the last bag and we went outside, locking the door behind us, leaving Helen and Carlos alone, locked in the house surrounded by woods. We loaded the stuff into the SUV and got into the car. Amber asked, "Isn't it too cruel to leave them there alone?" I replied that they would be left here alone, not only locked in the house, but needing to pay the rest of the house payment, and they didn't have any money. Fred laughed. "We only paid half of the house. The next half had to be paid when we left, and I left Helen with no money. The signal is bad here and there is no internet, but they will still be found since the lake house owners are due back tomorrow," I explained. We continued on our way and decided to discuss my next steps. I decided that the first thing I needed to do was consult with an attorney and start the divorce process. Amber offered her assistance, mentioning a good professional who could help me. Fred added that it was also important to take care of my emotional state and offered several contacts of professional psychologists. I declined the psychologist, but made a note of the attorney's contact. On returning home in the morning, I immediately began preparing the documents. Attached to them was a photograph taken last night. Thanks to the flash, everything was clearly visible. I also locked our joint electronic accounts so that Helen would not have access to the funds. The locks on the house had been replaced and an alarm system installed just in case. I started packing up Helen's things and found in her winter jacket a pack of condoms we never used and $15,000 in cash. I left the money in the jacket and put it in my bag. I didn't feel like taking any of the despicable items. During the day, I gathered up all of Helen's belongings and left them outside the door. The porch was littered with her things. I didn't care if someone came along and stole them. That was no longer my problem. I was comforted by the fact that the house was all mine. It had been a gift from my parents before I married Helen, and she couldn't claim it. 4 days later, Helen was back in town with Carlos and headed straight for my house. I was at work at the time and received a notice of an attempted break-in at my house. A few minutes later, the security forces arrived. In the evening, when I arrived at the police station, I laughed out loud when I saw the two of them sitting in a cell at the police station. I confirmed that Helen was my wife, although the court case was still pending. Soon, she would be my ex. When security arrived at my house, they saw a man with a bat and a woman trying to break in. Both were caught and jailed for a few days. Now Carlos had to pay for a new window. At the police station, I made it clear to him that he should stay away from me. A month later, the first court hearing took place. The divorce process was complicated and emotionally draining. Helen tried to contact me several times, but I realized that for our mutual good, we needed to give each other space. Meetings with my lawyer and the police took a lot of energy. I was tested for sexually transmitted diseases, and thankfully the results came back negative. Unlike Helen, who tested positive, this put Carlos at risk of criminal prosecution for engaging in unprotected intimacy, especially given his irregular medication. However, I didn't care much about that anymore. The important thing was that I was healthy. The hardest part was accepting that life would be very different without Helen. We had spent so much time together that her absence felt like a missing part of me. But as each day passed, I learned to accept this new situation. I was focusing on building a new life. Amber and Fred became my pillars of support during this difficult period. They were always there for me during the tough times, helping me look forward. Their friendship reminded me that despite all the losses, there are still people who love and support me. Gradually, I began to find comfort in the little things: evening walks, reading books I had long wanted to read, and even work that helped me distract myself. I began to rediscover the pleasure of solitude, finding in it not only sadness but also an opportunity for personal growth. One day, sitting by the river and watching the sunset, I realized that despite all the pain and loss, new horizons were unfolding before me. Life after Helen would be different, but that didn't mean it would necessarily be worse. I began to feel ready to embrace the new reality with an open heart, ready for the new challenges and opportunities it would bring. As each day went by, I started to feel a little different. I wouldn't say it got easier, that's not the right term. Rather, I became more centered and found the strength to face the future without fear or regret. Amber and Fred continued to support me, and their friendship became an anchor that kept me from falling into despair. My morning walks became a ritual. I would walk along the riverbank, reflecting on what I wanted to change in my life. I realized that I wanted to take more time for myself, my hobbies and interests that had once been neglected. As I sat in the cafe sipping my coffee, I felt truly calm for the first time after everything that had happened. I opened my notebook and started listing all the things I had always wanted to do but had put off. The list was long, from trips I wanted to take to skills I wanted to learn. I suddenly realized that the world around me was still full of possibilities, even if one chapter of my life had ended. Returning to work was another step forward. I discovered that my passion for automobiles had not waned. On the contrary, I began to put even more enthusiasm into it, seeing it not just as a job, but as a way to express myself. My old Mustang, which previously seemed like a reminder of the past, now filled me with a sense of pride and accomplishment. The hardest part was learning to trust people again. Meeting new people and interacting with coworkers wasn't always easy, but gradually I learned to open up to the world, realizing that not all stories end the way Helen and I did. Helen has herself to blame for the situation she has at the moment. She now lives in a modest room in another state. Her life isn't working out. She didn't finish college and she quit her job. Her affair didn't bring her happiness, and that's her own fault. A man I once considered a friend is now in prison, and that's his fault too. I didn't do anything wrong to those people. They chose their own path, and I only helped them get where they need to be. It's important to keep your sanity and believe in the best. Thank you for your attention to my story. This is the end of the story. We'll be interested to hear what you think. Do you think the main character did the right thing by deciding to divorce his wife immediately? Why do you think the wife's friend and her partner sided with the protagonist? Why did the protagonist's friend decide to seduce his friend's wife? Why did the wife commit adultery? Share your opinion in the comments. Also, do not forget to subscribe to the channel and put a like. Good luck!